Hi, today we're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. So, these errors are very common in hypothesis testing. So, what's happening in hypothesis testing is we have a population and we are drawing samples from those populations. And based on these samples, we're trying to estimate or ascertain certain population parameters. And hypothesis testing is whether those parameters or whether those estimators are really correct. So we do hypothesis testing to verify that. Since our conclusions are drawn are based on these samples, it may not necessarily these conclusions are always right. So in those cases, type 1 and type 2 errors can happen. So type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis when it's actually true. So when we reject null hypothesis when the test statistics value doesn't fall within the range of critical values. So in those cases, we reject the null hypothesis. Uh, but what happens if that null hypothesis which we reject is actually true? Population parameters does lie within those critical values, but based on our samples, we rejected the null hypothesis. So this is an example of type 1 error. Type 2 error is failing to reject null hypothesis when it is actually false. It's like we kind of say this population parameters is falling between these range of value when it's actually not falling, because there are limitation of samples. We did talk about the biases which can happen while taking the samples, like data mining biases, survivor biases, time period biases. So these samples may not be correct all the time. Due to that, these type 1 and type 2 errors happen. Power of test, which is 1 minus type 2 error. So this is the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when it's false. So we have a table here. You can see in this table, topmost in columns we have accepting null hypothesis and rejecting null hypothesis, and in rows we are seeing whether null hypothesis is actually true or is actually false. So power of test falls in this bracket of this table when we are correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when it is actually false. So uh, generally, if type 1 error increases, the type 2 decreases. So type 1 error, there is a relation between these two. Type 1 error is also called alpha error, which represent the significance level. Because when we're talking about 95% confidence level, so we are saying there's a 5% significance level when we reject the null hypothesis. So in those cases, this 5% is the probability we may incorrectly reject the null hypothesis. So this is type 1 error is also a significance level error. So if we want to decrease we want to decrease both type 1 and type 2 error, by just changing the significance level will not help. uh, in fact, it may make the situation worse. So the way to reduce both type 1 and type 2 error is to increase the sample size. um, the higher the power of test, the more reliable of hypothesis testing. Thank you.